Good morning. I'm MJ from Lioness Publications, and this morning we're going to cover some charts that I have on Donald Trump. And these charts are ones that I create using proprietary software I designed about, more than 20 years ago. And it's pretty straightforward. And the nice thing about the software is it takes out any type of interpretation errors. It's just sort of, well, this is just the way it is. And it compares everyone sort of to with the same standards. So let's take a look first at Donald Trump's, what I call a risk yield chart. And the risk yield, in effect, identifies whether you're facing a period, and these are always done per year, whether you're facing a period that's going to have more easy accomplishments or more challenging times. It doesn't mean you can't get things accomplished when things are challenging. In fact, for some people, it causes them to actually try harder and to get things accomplished. And on the flip side, just because things are easy doesn't mean you get things accomplished. Sometimes people just sort of sit back and they don't do anything. So it's just an indicator of what is sort of set up astrologically. Now, the nice things about these charts is I don't need to have an actual time of birth, although it helps. So the first one we have is the risk yield. The yield is noted in blue on the upper part of the chart, and the risk is noted at the bottom in red or, in effect, pink. Now, there are two types of risk and yield. In effect, one I call a transient and one I call a core. Now, in effect, I track, and this is done twice a month on the 1st and the 15th, I track the astrological angles that are occurring. And in effect, I do some calculations, and I get a value, and I chart that out. It's as simple as that. So if we take a look at Trump's chart, risk yield for 2025, we can see that at the beginning of the year, he had more yield, but now as we're moving into the rest of the year, he's got more risk. So from just a simple perspective, we have in effect that the earlier part of the year was probably easier, which it was. He was just elected. People were willing to give him, a lot of leeway. And he didn't really come out with too many controversial, except for the pardons, right out of the gate. But as we moved into the middle part of the year, what we had was he started putting, the tariffs on, and that was actually in spring. He was talking about them. And then as we moved into the summer, there was sort of like very little things going on because, in effect, it was, very little risk that he had, very little yield, but he was also not accomplishing much. A lot of countries were very worried about the tariffs, and a lot of people in the States were. As we move to the latter part of the year, what we have is now he's moving more into a risk period because we have more of the red or the pink rather than the blue. Now, the next chart I have is what I call a delta core. And what that does is it actually, delta transient core. And what this does is it actually, in effect, takes the risk and the yield and simply minuses them from each other to see whether do we have more risk in a period or more core. So it actually gives us a little bit better idea of actual what is prevalent during that time. As we can see in this, we still have, in effect, the yield area and a risk. And we can see that, yes, the beginning part of the year was a more yield for Donald Trump. As we're moving into the latter part of the year, we can see that that trend line has just sort of gone all the way down. So it's definitely into the risk. Now, I want to note that there's a black line and there's a green line. The black line is the core. So this is the one that is tracking sort of long-term trends versus the core is tracking shorter-term trends. And what that means is, for example, what I usually use to explain this is something like, and I do this a lot for corporate charts. But a core trend is, let's do the transit first. Transient trend would be a company providing an earnings report. When the earnings report comes out, there could be a spike up or down in the price of the stock. But what happens is that that's not the end of the story. So it shows up as a transit, but then it also shows up as a core. Because if there's an earnings spike, what can happen is the company will now maybe invest in something else that can actually provide a lot of return. So that's the core trend. Now, there's momentum when you look at something like the risk yield or the delta, where we see all of a sudden it moves significantly from, let's say, a yield to a risk position or vice versa. So we can see that things change. And that's important because that usually reflects in someone's life. Now, I do these charts for both, corporations, for people, for countries. And again, it doesn't get too deep into the weeds, but it just sort of gives you an overall look at how your year might be. Now, in this case, Donald Trump's year, from looking at the risk yield, has quite a bit of activity because we have both, risk and yield, pretty significant during the year. But it could be in some cases that there's very little activity. If it's a year that's very little going on. Now, does this capture everything in your life? No, no, it doesn't. But it's a good indicator. So it's a good little tool to see how your year is going. Now, I'm probably going to be having a special on this sometime in November for the coming year. So you might want to be checking my website on that. Okay? Have a good one. Bye now.